So with that, I think since we have all of our speakers and over 140 attendees in the room, I will start with an acknowledgement of country, just to say that I'm joining you today from native land, specifically the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm acknowledging and paying respect to all Indigenous and First Nation people who are joining us today, expressing my gratitude to their care over millennia, over the lands that we inhabit, and finally, my solidarity with the unfinished struggle to decolonize. And if you're comfortable with that, I invite others to share in the chat where they are joining them from. From here, I wish to state that we recognize the impact of the climate crisis, imperial histories, and current geopolitics in putting Indigenous and other marginalized communities on the front lines. I'm starting with this framing to remind ourselves of the outsized role that a handful of corporations have played in not just historical emissions, but the creation of deliberate deception on the issue of climate change. We now know that they have hidden information about climate change for more than a generation and instead invested in misinformation and climate denial. This is juxtaposed against the waters, lands, forests, and biodiversity that communities have cared for over centuries. We are here today breathing and living because of that care, because of our foremothers, because of unvalued and unwritten contributions. We are in danger now because of an economic order that discounts this incredible feminized and third world contribution that profits from our labor, monetizes our resources, and obfuscates responsibilities, whether in the form of polluter pays principle or reparations for slavery or for colonial violence. So with that, I now want to move forward to an introduction to today's event. What has brought us together today and why? Today's event is adjacent to the efforts of a wide range of civil society organizations and concerned individuals who supported a sign-on letter objecting to the Memorandum of Understanding announced in May between the investment firm BlackRock and UN Women, which is the UN agency working for gender equality and the empowerment of women. We submitted this letter to UN Women leadership on 9th of August with 598 signatures, of which 354 are from organizations. It has since surpassed 650 signatures. We will leave it open till this Friday if anyone wishes to show their support. And we'll just share the link to the sign-on form in the chat in just a second. Okay, so like I said, this form is open for us, for anyone to sign on, anybody to support this letter and this campaign and the positions that we're holding against this wider issue of corporate capture. Since initiating this letter, which was co-drafted by feminist economists, former UN staff, trade unions, and other activists, we have heard from UN Women that the MOU is on pause, which is not clear to us what that means. We hold this event today to create public understanding of why pause needs to become stop. We also understand that other groups have asked for publishing the MOU and reviewing what has been agreed to. However, those of us behind this letter take the position that agreements like this, like with fossil fuel or military industries, there's no good that can come from this. So before handing the floor to our first speaker, I want to briefly mention a few things for those who are unfamiliar. First of all, what is BlackRock? It was founded in 1988, so a millennial company, if you will. It is known as the world's largest asset manager. In recent years, it has led the charge in promotion of a new style of investment that is known as ESG investment. That stands for economic, social, and governance. In this arena, gender lens or gender impact investment can be considered a subset of this approach. The idea being that private investment or capital can be used to do good. This, however, does not address systemic issues, and some of our speakers today will expand on that. I also want to alert everyone to the words of a former BlackRock executive who last year said ESG was, and I quote, a dangerous placebo that harms the public interest, end quote. And you can go read his essay series, The Secret Diary of a Sustainable Investor. I want to draw our attention to the recent news that BlackRock has lost $1.7 trillion of clients' money in the first 6 months of 2022. This reminds us of the volatile nature of the space and how losses and debt are always borne by the public while profits stay private. I also draw our attention to the role BlackRock has played in Sri Lanka. This is highlighted in the letter itself. 47% of Sri Lanka's sovereign debt is held by investment companies like BlackRock and British Ashmore. And actually, we could spend a long time talking about the bond market and vulture funds and what it means for a small island developing country to default on such loans. But from here, I will just jump to corporate capture and the call for a system change, which has been a core mantra for the feminist movement for a long time, but this slogan really originated coming out of the Beijing Plus 25 review. I want to emphasize that we are opposing this style of corporate partnership because this is the latest symptom of corporate capture of multilateral spaces, the growing invitation of and the influence of financial behemoths, even by the institutions that are supposed to be our allies. We have, since the launch of our letter, also seen in the news that UNDP is partnering with oil companies in Colombia, despite vehement opposition earlier from indigenous groups for just this type of partnership. And previously, we also saw Microsoft sign an agreement with OHCHR for $5 million. This is back in 2017. We are here calling out this partnership, and we are following through with this type of action and advocacy because of our democratic function as civil society and people's movements. We believe that as much as we should be here engaging with government and intergovernmental entities, our role is not to please officials and the powers that be, but to hold them to account in whatever way that serves the people, the communities, and the planet the best. At the end of the day, we want a strong UN Women. We want a strong United Nations that continues to be the space where human rights is the foundation stone and the starting point for progressive development and protection of peoples and planet. So with this framing, I hope people understand what this event is about and what the thinking has been on this issue. And with that, I would like to welcome and invite our first speaker, Cynthia Rodriguez, who is national organizer for Mijente and the No Tech for ICE campaign. Mijente is a political home and organizing hub for Chicano and Latino people across the US and in Puerto Rico. So Cynthia, you have the floor. I will just give you a reminder at about 8-9 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Cynthia Rodriguez. I am a national organizer with Mijente, where we have been leading the No Tech for ICE campaign since 2018. And I'm really, really honored to be here with everybody. We're here in support of this call, right, of this demand. And I do want to dig into BlackRock's investment in companies such as particularly Palantir and what that means for the work that we have been doing as a part of the No Tech for ICE campaign for over 5 years now. But first, I think it might be helpful to share some background on this campaign on No Tech for ICE. So I'm talking about a campaign that comes out of grassroots organizing. I'm talking about a campaign that began through conversations that were happening on the ground with community members, with some of our members, where there were questions about how personal information, sensitive information, was getting into the hands of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, in the US. And so these were questions that we brought to our partners, because this work we do not do alone. These were questions that through research, we began to really break down. And through working with our partners and through research, we began to identify that there were 4 big ways in which big tech and big data were fueling the US deportation and detention machine. We were seeing data broker companies, right, that sell and share our personal data. We were seeing data analytics like Palantir. We're seeing biometrics. We're seeing cloud software, right, which Amazon is a big name when we're talking about cloud software, right? So we're talking about data that's collected about us, about our communities, data that's analyzed, data that's taken from our bodies, from our very bodies, and then stored somewhere, right? And so all of that you can read more about in a report that we put out several years ago called Who's Behind ICE? And that was back in 2018 when we started to tell this story. And then in 2019, we really focused on telling the story of the direct harm that a company such as Palantir was causing to migrant communities, to immigrant communities throughout the US. And I'm naming Palantir because Palantir is a company that is receiving support, that is receiving investment from BlackRock. And so Palantir software, the software that Palantir creates, has caused great harm to immigrant communities in the US, and we know globally as well, right? And this is happening and has happened particularly through efforts to, one, target and arrest the family members of children crossing the border, and two, in workplace raids. And so today, now several years later in 2022, there continues to be an enormous amount of money that comes out of criminalizing migrants. There's a lot of money in the digital surveillance and policing of migrant communities, right? We know that a company such as Palantir has received millions and millions of dollars from ICE contracts, particularly since 2013. And to this day, Palantir continues to have a contract with ICE, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the US. And this is a contract that we know could end as early as November of this year, but this is a fight that continues. And so our demands for no tech for ICE continue alongside demands for no tech for apartheid, continue alongside demands for no tech for tyrants, continue alongside demands to block BlackRock. And so I also want to share that since 2018, since we began this campaign, more and more people have really been talking about big tech and data in a much more mainstream way here in the US. But at the same time, the movement that has called for no tech for ICE has also grown. It's grown with community, it's grown with organizers, it's grown with law students and librarians, it's grown with shareholders, tech workers, and the list goes on and on. And I also think that within the world and of movement work, of people's campaigns, our campaigns have also grown stronger because we've been more and more clear now about the connections between different technologies, between how communities are targeted by different technologies and how we fight together. And so with that in mind, I want to uplift a report that came out last year in 2021 from our friends at Friends of the Earth US and the Transnational Institute. And I think the report will get dropped into the chat. This report, Cashing in the Crisis, this report underlines how the world's biggest asset managers, right? And here we're talking about BlackRock, but also State Street and Vanguard, have been building their wealth on the backs of the communities that are most impacted by the ongoing climate crisis. And that's especially thinking about these companies' investments in fossil fuels, in agribusiness, but also the border and surveillance industry. Because when we talk about the climate crisis, we're talking about climate disasters, we're talking about pollution, the list goes on and on, everything that comes with it. And this very much includes racism and displacement that leads to migration. And so in that respect, right, it's important now more than ever to understand and to continue to break down and add nuance to how immigrant justice is about climate justice and vice versa, because we're living in a moment where border militarization, right, the violent extraction of the land are valued way above human life. We know that BlackRock, but also State Street and Vanguard, right, hold shares in the border and surveillance industry. And the impact of these investments is enabling state-led violence against immigrants, against migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in our current moment of crisis. And so this is money that is then extended to a company like Palantir, right? But also companies that are focused in general on private prison and the private prison industry, on migrant detention, names like CoreCivic and GEO Group, and even Amazon, right? And what this does is uphold violent border regimes, not just in the US, but globally. And so we're seeing that there's an investment, an interest, and a violent upholding of a system that's more interested in facial recognition, in algorithms or databases that harm our communities rather than meaningful solutions for climate change. And climate change is ongoing patterns of migration. And so just to start to wrap up, I'll just say that today we're looking at BlackRock's investments in human rights abuses, and that's happening through a company's volunteer out of these historical ties to the CIA in the US that has cut its teeth with government contracts that include military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies. And Palantir, what this company has done has been to create the target list, to construct profiles, to host a tip line where people can call into or send emails that does the work of facilitating immigration enforcement in the US. And as I shared, right, this has led to the separation of families, to massive workplace raids. And all of this is a part of a much larger story, a much larger system, or what I sometimes talk about as a much larger octopus of a digital dragnet, a migration digital dragnet that extends far beyond the US, right? And that digital dragnet has worked to, one, keep the work of a company such as Palantir under wraps behind closed doors. And so the work that we're doing here today, the work that we've been doing for several years now, has been to bring this large octopus of digital surveillance to light, to talk about the ways in which it affects us all, that there's technology that Palantir has, such as an investigative case management program, a program called Falcon, that have been tested on immigrant communities and that are then also used with other communities, that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is actually now building its own software that is set to replace these technologies from Palantir. And that although we're hearing that Palantir's contract could be up in November, we also know that the development of this custom-built software for ICE has been ongoing, that its budget has increased exponentially, that the budget for surveillance in the US has increased exponentially, and that they're behind their own schedule. So what we know then is that for us, this means that our work to be organized, to become larger than this octopus of immigrant digital surveillance, is that much more urgent, that much more important, and requires for us to be working at all levels. And so we'll continue to push back. There's a bipartisan narrative in the US where both Democrats and Republicans say that digital tools, that this technology is a better, safer, more gentle way to surveil people. And we know that that's not true. We know that immigrant justice, climate justice requires nothing less than an end to all digital surveillance. So thank you so much for having me, and I'll be available for any questions.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. This is such important framing. And although you were speaking about the real examples that your organization is working with in the context of the US, these types of programs and this type of data manipulation and exploitation of migrant labor I'm sorry, there's somebody else speaking. If I'm hearing another voice, could that be muted? Thank you. Sorry, I wanted to say that this is something that is a trend to across the world with different types of border forces and different movements of migrants. And I think this is a really important connection to make between the data regimes, surveillance, and investment, especially with the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women theme next year on innovation and technological change and education in the digital age for achieving gender equality. So thank you so much for starting us off with this framing, and I hope that we'll still have you for a little bit of discussion after the following speakers. So from here, I would have the pleasure to invite Miriam van der Siekel, the senior researcher at the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations, or SOMO. So Miriam specializes in issues around the financial sector and trade. And I invite her to tell us a little bit about what BlackRock is, how big it is, and how it makes its money of these functions of private finance, as well as why this industry is the problem through not just BlackRock and others as well. So Miriam, all yours.
So now I don't see Miriam. I think maybe she's had a connection issue because she was here before.
Okay.
So maybe we can go to Kate and then hopefully Miriam will be back.
Kate, are you with us?
I am, yes.
Okay. To briefly introduce Kate Lappin, she is the Asia Pacific General Secretary from Public Services International. PSI is also supporting a bigger initiative, the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research, or CICTAR, a global corporate tax research center that produces information and analysis to untangle the corporate tax web. And I think you know, these are important perspectives to bring together, just as Cynthia has. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Sanam, and hello, everybody. It's really wonderful to be invited to be part of this panel, which is a really important discussion, and I'm happy to see it's been taken so seriously once you know, the letter was circulated. I wanted to speak a little bit about both why I think this particular partnership with BlackRock is inappropriate, but also more broadly why I think that UN Women and UN agencies should not be partnering with corporations, that it is really undermining the entire purpose of the UN and enables a global problem of corporate capture of democracy that is clearly marginalizing the civil society and trade union organizations that had negotiated a space at the UN within the ILO in a clear structure to ensure that both employers and workers have an equal voice. Whilst that history, of course, was supposed to offer a new vision of what the social contract globally would look like, and how we could agree on a human rights framework that would enable both people, workers and employers, to have a voice, at least within the UN. The rest of the UN, of course, is intergovernmental, and we're repeatedly reminded as civil society that these are intergovernmental spaces, but we know that corporations have been able to circumvent that process, firstly by having representation as an observer, so well and truly above civil society status, but clearly by capturing UN agencies through these partnerships. So let me say something about BlackRock initially, and why I think you know, this is illustrative and not solely the problem. But BlackRock, I think, is, as Sanam said in the introduction, has widespread investments, including those that she mentioned, but is increasingly trying to promote itself as somehow responsive to both climate issues and social justice issues. However, if we look a little bit at the evidence, both of its investments, some of which were mentioned, but we also see investments in areas where corporations have well-known trade union rights violations. We've even seen investments where there is documented child labour in, for example, palm oil plantations in Papua New Guinea. And further, while I've noted BlackRock's response saying that, of course, they're trying to engage with the corporations that they invest in and it's not their role. But what we have seen is that BlackRock has repeatedly voted against any shareholder resolutions that have been proposed by trade unions or by social movements using progressive investors that seek to address social justice issues or climate issues. And one of them I think that's particularly illustrative is that BlackRock voted against a shareholder resolution relating to sexual harassment at Delta Airlines. The resolution really would not have had any significant impact on their investment in terms of their return on investment. It was simply asking the board to take a further interest in the problems of sexual harassment and address those issues, and not just simply leave it to the CEO or the internal processes where it clearly had failed. Their internal processes had clearly failed women that worked there. And BlackRock used its very substantial shareholder block to block that resolution. And there's, amongst trade unions, there's a committee for workers' capital. That means a committee to look at the way that workers' money is actually used by corporations like BlackRock through pension funds, and seeking to ensure that workers' money is used more responsibly. And so that committee that represents billions of dollars of workers' money has made a number of proposals relating to a broad range of corporations, shareholder resolutions that would support workers, and BlackRock has voted against every single one of them. So I think that's really illustrative of the fact that the constant pinkwashing or the need to present an image of supportive of women, supportive of climate justice, but actually when it comes down to actual action, and I think the shareholder resolutions is a clear example, they failed to actually support any meaningful change. But I think that illustration and an earlier illustration, I was involved in the movement earlier in 2015 to oppose UN Women's partnership with Uber. And that was, of course, another example of an entirely inappropriate partnership, where I think, well, even at the time, it was very clear that this was not decent work. But now we can see more recently that Uber, has at that time was internally agreeing to break laws, to undermine democracy, to support violence. In fact, we've seen in the most recent leaks. And of course, it was a successful campaign, and we were happy to have been able to meet with UN Women. But some of the outcomes of that meeting with civil society and trade unions is worth noting, because we had sought an agreement to collectively review the principles on which these partnerships are based, and try and instead look at the purpose of the partnerships and whether they actually could have any role in advancing women's human rights. For me, I think more broadly for PSI and our 30 million members that we represent, these partnerships are always going to be problematic. We can't endorse any corporate partnerships because corporate power, I think it's fairly widely recognized now that corporate power is one of the key drivers of gender inequality. And the growing corporate power around the world is a driver of obscene levels of wealth inequality, but it also is capturing democracy, and in doing so is able to shift any capacity to improve, but particularly the access to public services that women may have. It diminishes the concentration of wealth in corporate hands rather than in public hands or in workers' hands, means that so many countries around the world are now having to privatize their public services, really minimize their investments in the kind of services that would address gender inequality, whether that be health services or water, energy, public transport, all the things essential that really have been demonstrated to reduce gender inequality. And so BlackRock is an example of a corporation that invests broadly in the privatization of public services, but the concentration of corporate power is also clearly the main driver. Secondly, I think the corporate capture of democracy and of the UN agencies is designed to not just pink wash or blue wash, but also to have those agencies actually working in their interests. The example earlier from Colombia is a really horrifying one, but more broadly, I think the corporations are working in the UN agencies working corporate interests when they start to propose solutions like gender bonds, for example, or even the idea that somehow corporations working in partnership with corporations, regardless of whether they accept money or not, is the way to bring about gender equality. But we also we've seen, for example, in UNSCAP in our region here in Asia Pacific, working on a PPP pipeline, which is public-private partnership pipeline. And this is directly promoting privatization. And privatization, as I said, is there's no shortage of evidence that we could present around the link between privatization and the diminishing of women's rights, but also more broadly of human rights and of the most marginalized groups. So there's, I think, boundless evidence of why we should be we need UN agencies to do the complete opposite, which is to clearly think about what their role would be in limiting corporate power, in actually addressing the democratic deficits that we have, redistributing wealth, and promoting investment actually in the things that we need, the public services, and broader democratic institutions, including trade unions, that would actually bring about a fairer, more just world. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to join discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I think we have Miriam with us now. Miriam, I briefly introduced you already as a senior researcher with SOMO, but I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us more from your intensive research on BlackRock.
Right. Thank you very much. Sorry, we had like new internet things, and of course it's things go wrong. I've been researching the financial sector because I thought it was like the crucial part of capitalism, and too little kind of civil society organizations were able to get a grip on it. Certainly after the financial crisis, everybody was in alert, and then slowly it was more we didn't see too much focus on it. A lot of attention is on banks. That's absolutely very necessary. But of course, BlackRock is one of the three very large asset managers. And I would kind of start, I will explain a little bit more what it means, and especially in this case with this agreement with UN Women. But I think, to start with, the main message on why I also really want to stop it is that it's like, if you really look even at the press release, you could really see like who is profiting, who is benefiting, because on the one hand, BlackRock is wanted to have new funds, which means, new income, new probably even reputation of being good on ESG, of which they don't have knowledge about. And then they can use the knowledge by UN Women. Well, there is no, as far as I can see, and as far as we don't know what the MOU is, there's absolutely no agreement of, that there would be anything positive coming out of it. And I would say the real problem is, first of all, that it clearly says in the press release, it's about getting competitive financial returns, which we mean that for BlackRock itself, it is even a profit margin of 30%. And secondly, there is absolutely no commitment, as we've heard already with the two speakers, and sorry if I missed some of the second speaker, and there's absolutely no commitment by BlackRock to divest or to what they also want to do, to engage with the companies that are really harmful for women, and quite, I think, the majority of their funds and the shares that they're having in it would be under that one. So just to go a little bit more into BlackRock and why it's so important to really understand why it is. So BlackRock itself always says, we are an asset manager, means we don't own the shares and the bonds. It's up to our customers. And basically what they do, they repackage bonds and shares in all kind of funds and make it attractive for others to invest in it. The problem is very much with BlackRock, and that's very much not understood sufficiently, is that actually it's BlackRock still kind of managing and owning the shares, basically. I mean, they say they don't own it, but they have like voting rights on the companies. They have also the negotiation power to deal with sovereign debt when it's, especially when it needs to be renegotiated. So, and the second very problematic issue with the asset managers is that they are saying, and especially BlackRock is doing that, and I find it extremely problematic. They're saying it's our fiduciary duty to provide the most profits for our clients. And that's exactly what is happening all the time when there are resolutions by others to say that the company has to change so that there is no exploitation of workers, of women, of natural resources, of climate. I mean, all the different issues, and actually quite a lot of campaigns against BlackRock. But still, there is still this argument that the fiduciary duty is to extract as much money as possible. It's a concept which I think is, especially in the US, as far as I know, it's not being legislated in the EU, and it is extremely problematic. And so that's why then they kind of are BlackRock has been voting at companies against sustainability. And that has been another problem that has been getting some more awareness about it, but still. We could see, for instance, now on all companies, they are not voting on progressive resolutions on oil companies because they are benefiting now from the high income that these companies are having. So as already been told, BlackRock is one of the three kind of oligopolists and the biggest one. It reached 10 trillion under management, and that still means that it is basically creating funds, more and more funds, in which it's easy for investors, retail investors, professional investors, institutional investors to invest in. So that's where also I think the agreement with women, with UN Women comes in, because as we heard, it's getting more popular to invest in ESG funds. We can criticize it, I mean, later on, but the thing is that gender issues are important for them for two reasons. First of all, these ESG funds are getting subject to what is called ESG ratings. So it's there are analysts like Morningstar, like Sustainalytics, with others who are rating how far these ESG funds really are beneficial for climate, environment, social, and governance. And on gender issues, normally the ratings are quite low because there is no experience in by those managers on how to deal with it and how to assess a company, how it deals with gender issues, with women, etc., and how to make sure that that is also being reflected in reporting. So that's why, of course, BlackRock would be very interested to have all this knowledge by UN Women, because then they don't have to invest in it themselves. So that's kind of one thing, that to kind of make them much more, these ESG funds, much more attractive with higher ratings, and therefore, you know, getting more clients, getting more fees, more profits, etc. The second issue is that there are quite some arguments that you might have heard that the companies.
Miriam, your sound is fading a little for me. Do you think you can move closer to the microphone?
Yeah, sure. I'll
Perfect,
try.
thank you.
Closer. So the other issue, which is really of concern and why BlackRock might be interested, is that there is this argument again and again that companies who have a diverse board with a lot of women, or at least a decent number of women in the board, but also in management and so on, that they are more profitable and on the long term also probably much better. So in that sense, for BlackRock to make sure that their funds are profitable because the companies and the shares that they are investing in are from companies that are profitable, that's also why they might be very interested to see how far gender issues are being dealt with by the companies that they are investing in. Just one thing to make sure, probably, I'm sorry if that has already been said, but BlackRock invests in almost all the companies in the world. Yeah, so it really has a grip on the corporate world. And also, not only does it have a grip because it has in most of those companies, the majority of the vote. I mean, majority can still be 3% because most of the investors only have 0.1%, 0.2%, whatever. And secondly, BlackRock is being the voting and on the annual meetings of the companies is being followed by others. And they realized that that was an important role, and they at some point say we will be more progressive in our voting, but I'm not sure how that's happening. By the way, they are not discovering or not, reporting back to those who are owning the shares, so the ones who are investing in the funds, how they're voting. So there's complete unaccountability on how BlackRock behaves towards its companies. And of course, BlackRock has been time and again making sure that the company is having the highest profits by very exploitative practices, and actually not assessing how the company is making those profits. Even if it's doing so, it's not very clear. I just wanted to say one thing also on the bond issue. The bond issue and the sovereign basically the sovereign bonds came very much an issue for BlackRock, because this was like a new area of funds that they could be created. They called it fixed income funds. And suddenly they discovered they could do the same with the sovereign bonds from governments in the same way as they were doing in shares. Put them in all kind of different funds, ask for the fees. However, that meant that they were then buying up those bonds, some of which were at very high interest rates, because some of these countries especially wanted to have high interest rates because they were supposedly very risky. And also to attract quite a lot of money. And there was a lot of money. I don't know if you remember, in 2018, there was kind of very low interest rates in Europe and US, and there was a lot of money that wanted to go somewhere else, especially because of QE. You could, I mean, the IMF and some of my research has shown how there was a link between investors being extremely greedy on getting these fixed income funds, and then also the bonds being bought. But some of these interests were extremely high. I mean, I did research on one by Ghana. For 30 years, there was an 8.9% interest yearly. So you basically, for a 1 billion loan, Ghana had to repay 2 billion. So there's no I mean, that's why, of course, Ghana now is in a deep, deep problem because they were so interested. The problem is that the BlackRock and others, they say by their fiduciary duty, we have to ask that all these countries are paying back. But that means they don't assume the risk. They got higher interest rates because it's risky, but then when it's risky and there is a kind of a problem with repayment of the debt, they don't want to repay on it. And the negotiations on those debts, sovereign debts, are extremely secret. It's very difficult to find out what is happening. With Argentina, for instance, there were some reports and it was getting really very nasty. And actually they also, there's also a problem of having the capacity because each country is case by case negotiations. So can you imagine BlackRock being in all those negotiations, let alone all the rest? So I think that's where it's extremely problematic that they don't look from a gender perspective that canceling the debt or at least renegotiating it as soon as possible is exactly what would be needed to make sure that public services for women are not being undermined. And we have no guarantee, no information whether or not, any of these aspects have been taken into account. So I think that was some of the issues that I wanted to say. One of the issues is that the problem also is that BlackRock on the one hand says, oh, we want to have partnership with UN women and we want to be gender friendly. But at the same time, when there are legislations and legislative proposals coming up to be very strict on ESG, which was, one of them was then on taxonomy, even if that was only on green, but even there, climate change might have a big impact on women and gender as well. They have been lobbying like hell against it. So that's where you can see how there is a disconnect of what they want to do and, what they are saying, what they're doing is completely disconnected and dishonest. So that would be my input for you to have arguments why it should go against.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for this overview. I think we should note down all of your recommendations and do some good research as well as read up. I think we're now going to go into a brief discussion and questions session. As mentioned in the chat, we'd like you to use the Q&A box option, as some of you have done so already. So I'll read out some of those questions for our speakers today. And I will also call on one person who has shared some resources that perhaps can be spoken to as well. Just to recap, we're not going to call on everybody individually who has raised their hands. We'd rather you use the Q&A function because we have almost 200 attendees with us today, and we won't be able to actually hear every single question out. So the first really excellent question from Julia Lukomnik is an appreciation of the critique of investment in firms and corporations that take action that go against feminist values, recognizing that we live within a capitalist economy and that part of feminist ethic is caring for our people into old age. What tools and tactics do you all suggest we use instead to ensure pensions are available? So I think I suggest that this be directed first to Kate. I think we have had some discussions around the importance of pensions, portable pensions. And Cynthia, if you have any inputs on that, because the idea of portability and the importance of that for migrant workers is something that you might have some ideas on. I also welcome speakers to respond to each other as well. Kate, having heard Miriam's excellent overview, if you have any thoughts on that as well. So those two things, the pensions, what should we do about that, and any reflections on Miriam's inputs.
Okay, well, on the point that was made about pensions, I mean, of course, firstly, pensions shouldn't be privatized. So the ILO is some time ago, in fact, it was when Isabel Ortiz was at the ILO. Some of you might know she's a great feminist economist, I think I could say, and was formerly with the ILO, wrote a really compelling paper on the privatisation of pensions and how damaging it is. So my first answer to that is that we should, that is the privatisation of pensions that really only started when Pinochet, I think, was the first to do that, and otherwise pensions had been public, and it should remain part of our campaign is to demonstrate is that pensions themselves, the entitlement to a pension shouldn't be linked to your income from a feminist perspective, of course, right? Because women then end up in poverty in retirement. So a public pension system can actually be a far more equitable one first. Secondly, the money then can be invested in public services through the government rather than privatise public services through investors. So that would be a clear action, I think, from a feminist perspective. Of course, there are some now private pensions trying to be, women-led or and so forth, that I guess could be a temporary response. But as she said, we live in a deeply, not just capitalist, because you could have a capitalist system with public pensions, but a deeply neoliberal economy. So there may be others that have other thoughts on pensions. Look, I think everything that Miriam said is really a compelling reason why we have to be particularly careful of BlackRock and other large investment companies, and that the methods they use to extract as much profit from the economy. Sanam mentioned the work we've done on corporate tax accountability, and that is dissecting some of the corporations that BlackRock has invested in and looking at the way that they have in fact used tax havens after having taken public money. This is the fact that many of these corporations get rich by public money. In that case, it's care, like there are care systems that are privatised, have taken public money, supposedly for care, then put that money into tax havens through a series of, tricky methods, and say they don't have enough money to pay the women that work there decent wages. And these are the kind of corporations that are being invested in by both pension funds and big investment funds like BlackRock. We've actually tracked back, unfortunately, that many of those are owned by Canadian public workers' pension funds. So it's I think there's so much work to do, but really this kind of expose is really important to put the pressure on both governments but also UN agencies around their obligation to act, not to partner, but to act to address these issues.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I think Cynthia has dropped off. So let me just acknowledge that there are a few more questions and pivot to Miriam if you'd like to address any of them. We have some excellent questions around what type of evidence or policy influence does the feminist movement feel is missing that think tanks can focus on contributing to move the dial on ESG and gender washing? What would global solidarity practices look like to help lobby those issues with one voice? That's a really helpful question. And then we have another on how the UN is being privatized at the expense of not only people, but governments in the global south, and what can we do about it, including the financing of the UN by the member states. And let me see. Miriam, do you have any thoughts on the questions we have coming in, or any other comments?
I haven't seen all of them, but when I was thinking about it, it's like, don't forget, BlackRock has shareholders themselves, and at some point it was pushed by its shareholders to be not so nasty towards Walmart, or not to be extractive so much about Walmart, because all the workers were completely being exploited. Because the thing is, I've been working a lot on sustainable finance. There's a lot of comments to be said, but there is a law in Europe that says that investors have to report on how they deal with ESG, so environmental, social, and governance risks and impacts, especially on the risks. And therefore, you know, BlackRock could also be under pressure to kind of make sure that they are more transparent, or etc. But of course, that is completely within the system. The problem is also, we have been able in Europe to do a campaign when BlackRock was actually asked by the European Commission as a consultant to advise on how banks should integrate ESG. So you can imagine, you know, asking, and that was, a quite interesting campaign, because the way how the consultancy was being awarded to BlackRock was pretty fraud. Even the ombudsperson then came in. We asked the ombudsperson to come in, was also condemning it. The commission had to be more transparent about what happened there. And there's quite some evidence about how BlackRock is lobbying against kind of the issues that they are saying they want to promote, basically all these kind of things. Don't forget also on pension funds, BlackRock is also managing quite a lot of assets by pension funds, even my own pension fund, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, the Netherlands is completely privatized. I'm Belgium, but when I came to the Netherlands, we have to be part of a private pension fund, which is basically for public workers, pension fund for public workers, but that pension fund is even investing through BlackRock. So you can imagine how difficult this is, and they don't want to engage with us. We do campaigns, etc. So that's also quite an issue where I think people really can find out whether or not their pension fund, if you are in a country where it's privatized, that you really check whether it's also having BlackRock as a manager, and to denounce it, and you know, in the long term, showing that this is not something that you want to be happening. In my case, it's extremely difficult to switch these kind of pension funds, unfortunately. I wasn't happy, but then you can campaign, and because you're like, you know, you're part of a pension. But there are quite some campaigns on BlackRock, and I think that would be nice to be joining them. It's, you know, against the fossil fuels. There's also one now against BlackRock holding sovereign bonds of Zambia. They were not willing to engage with those. And yeah, basically BlackRock is also extremely active in what is called reporting standards, so that they can say that they are sustainable, but that's actually not, they're manipulating all the indicators of the reporting. So again, you know, it's absolutely not helping to have any progress. The other thing is that the regulators are quite worried about the size of BlackRock and the way how it's being able to influence the markets. So there are discussions at the G20 and at international organizations on how to deal with it. I'm going to hopefully try and having more time to look into it in the second half of the year. But if anybody would be interested, I think that would be a moment also to have campaigns, you know, what is all the wrongs. It's not only about the size, it's also how it's influencing and so on, because the financial stability authorities are only concerned about financial stability and not about the impact it has on multinationals, on how the multinationals are operating, how they are extracting value out of the economy and society rather than the opposite. I'll leave it by that.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And Kate, also the fact that you raised privatization going back to Pinochet makes me think about you know, the recent elections and the efforts to have the new constitution in Chile, and just if this is the moment that Chile is saying that neoliberalism began here and now it will die, maybe this is also another idea that needs to go. We have had some really sort of insightful comments from Sofia Monsal from FIAN International. So I thought I'd give the floor to her for just a moment before we move to closing. FIAN International does incredible work on the right to food and is an incredible ally. So Just a couple of minutes to you, Sophia, and then we'll move to our closing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Excellent. So thank you very much again for organizing this and for organizing the whole action against this partnership of UN Women with BlackRock. Yes, my comments relate to our, let's say, policy domain, which is mainly food and agriculture. And as I shared some resources and the research, participatory action research that we have done with peasant organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, and rural women organizations on BlackRock, but more in general about financialization of territories and nature. And then you can see that BlackRock is actually controls many of the big corporations in agribusiness. And I just recently discovered that BlackRock is also behind pushing for the Global Alliance for Food Banking, which is trying to export this these charity responses to the current food crisis. This is the US model, you know, where corporations supposedly donate food to the poor and the hungry. And now they want to see this model, let's say, scale up at a global level in the current crisis. And they are really heavily pushing for this. And I discovered that BlackRock is one of the corporations supporting that. So this has enormous implications for care work, you know, for women's rights, as you can imagine. And therefore, I think it is very important to join hands, and it would be really great to see the feminist organizations taking the lead in perhaps putting into dialogue these different campaigns and initiatives that are, I think, around BlackRock. I think that would be really, really important. So therefore, we in FIAN are very supportive of this initiative, and we are very curious to see in future. So how to connect. I also share about the people's working group on multi-stakeholderism, which is this other key word for corporate capture, how to cooperate that and how to connect or put into dialogue the different campaigns around this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to acknowledge that we are not ignoring the questions that are asking why this agreement has taken place, or why did they move forward with this partnership. But I do acknowledge that there are UN Women staff attending this event today. I will be polite not to call out by name, but of course, many of us know certain leadership who is listed in the participants. So if anybody chooses to answer in the chat the questions around on why UN Women has entered into this agreement with BlackRock, and what has UN Women's response been, you are most welcome to address that in the chat. Having said that, I think we'd like to move to our closing from here. So first of all, thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing your insights and expertise from your different constituencies, as well as the depth of work and research that coming from the institutions that you're a part of. So from here, I am very, very pleased to move towards reflections from the two feminist organizations who co-hosted this webinar and worked together to publish the letter publicly as well on their websites. That would be AWID, the Association for Women's Rights in Development, and WEDO, the Women's Environment and Development Organization. So we have with us Sanyu Awori, who is the manager of the Building Feminist Economies program, and Bridget Burns, director of WEDO. So I do have some I invite initial thoughts from both of you, having heard from everybody today, as well as the wonderful engagement. And then I'm happy for you to be in dialogue with each other. I may throw in a few more questions. So firstly, Sanyu, tell us more about this opposition towards the MOU and the work that the feminist movement has been doing around gender impact and gender lens investment, which I see people are asking about already.
Thanks, Sanam, and thanks to all the speakers who have shared their experiences and insights, as well as those engaging in the chat. For us at AWID, we support the resistance to BlackRock because this is a joint feminist agenda that interconnects climate and economic justice, and also affirms the need for corporations to be held accountable for the impacts of their actions and policies. BlackRock, like Kate was saying earlier, is illustrative of the problem of corporate power. And so for us, this is part of our work to challenge corporate power and corporate impunity, as well as the rising power of the private sector in the UN, as well as in other intergovernmental spaces and processes. And so just to say that we're also part of a collective of feminists pushing for a binding treaty to regulate corporations and address corporate power. And so to invite you to join our resistance in this space, given all the interconnected demands. To also then talk about gender lens investment, and to say that this resistance, we support this resistance because we want to challenge the rise of false solutions like gender lens investment, articulated in this partnership with UN Women. Like Nancy dropped in the chat, what is it anyway? And yet it's becoming increasingly popular without having clear definitions or standards or evidence on how it actually contributes to social change. And gender impact investment is in fact being pitched as the silver bullet to fund gender equality and help deliver the sustainable development goals. Yet a large portion of these investments benefit from big business and transnational corporations, and they don't benefit feminist movements. And so we also reject this conflation between resourcing feminist agendas and gender impact assessment. We raise red flags because initiatives like this UN partnership with BlackRock packages capitalist interventions as the solutions to systemic problems by attracting finance and investment capital for social change. In reality, however, a large amount of public funds that should be going towards public goods and services and to support feminist movements ends up being diverted to subsidize corporate interests and investments, and not the other way around. So we're also tired of gender justice being instrumentalized to serve this neoliberal capitalist machine. And so we want to say that AWID is publishing a report to debunk and demystify gender impact investment, so feminist movements better understand this rising trend and its implications. And so we'll keep you posted as we launch the report later this year, and use that research as part of our advocacy to keep challenging partnerships like this. So those are just a few thoughts. Interested in Bridget, what you've got to complement and add, and so over to you.
Thank you, Sanyun. Thank you, Sanam. Thank you, all of the speakers. Again, I'm Bridget. I'm calling in from the unceded land of the Lenape people, and really, really pleased to be part of this frank and really deeply systemically feminist conversation. And would just echo everything that has been said here, that this is not just this moment, just this partnership, but this is part of a much larger problem within the context of multilateralism, within the context of increasing financial scarcity for public good, for social protection, and how that has driven the UN in particular to see the private sector as a funding partner over and above heeding the demands of grassroots and civil society organizations to analyze, critique, and call out corporate power, and the role of large transnational corporations, in particular in driving violent extractive capitalism. We see this in the spaces we engage in around climate change quite prevalently, where we spend an exorbitant amount of time opposing false solutions that are being driven by the private sector and that are being welcomed with open arms. And we are fighting as feminists for space to identify and outline what gender just climate solutions look like, how we need to understand a diversity of scale. And one of the biggest barriers to that are UN agencies who are unwilling to heed or listen to our calls to be challenging to corporate power. Even the simplest measures of critique of these partnerships that they entail true commitments for transformation. So I would never aim to respond on behalf of UN Women, but I do see a lot of some of the questions, and couldn't this be positive that UN Women could play a role for women's voices within these private sector partnerships? And this is what we are told consistently about these types of partnerships, that private sector has a transformative role to play, and UN agencies need to be in the space to do it. But consistently, we don't actually see that challenge to corporate power. We don't actually see these partnerships requiring any commitment on the side of the private sector that they are partnering with to actually take commitments to divestment or transformation towards systemic change in what they're investing in. And in fact, we're often met with broad brush hostility in UN spaces and kind of framed as civil society that are acting in disruptive or idealistic ways, and really undermining the critique of the vast ways in which companies are disrupting and causing harm to our social and planetary systems. So, we will not cede the critical space of multilateralism, but we will not shy away from calling out corporate capture. From the beginning, organizations like AWID and WEDO, we've engaged in spaces like the Generation Equality Forum, because we see the promise in developing collective transformative action, inviting in actors that are ready to make commitments to systemic change. And within our own action coalition, Action for Climate Justice, we spend a lot of time talking about shifting public and private finance and what that means and what that looks like. But we've been dismayed at the limitations of that conversation, where we've only seen the private sector, particularly from UN agencies, being viewed as an actor that can provide resources, as opposed to actors that wield capital in unjust and extractive ways, and that have power that needs to be significantly challenged, especially in line with the urgency of our social and planetary crises. So, I think that in summary to what everyone has said here, the challenge remains in the overall capture that we're seeing in this multilateral space, and just the frank disregard for the calls for transparency, for oversight, for engagement, for communication, and for this real commitment to seeing the UN as a space that has a role to challenge corporate power, because it fully understands the role in which corporate power plays in our current crises and extractive economy. And I'll pass back to you, Sanam.
Thank you. With the brilliance of both of you here today, I'm also just thinking about some of the questions that have been pouring in about what should we actually be doing. And I think one idea that I floated to some of you was that instead of pursuing some of these private partnerships, UN Women could potentially be the space where feminist economists can come alive and become a hub and really sort of bring out what feminist economics can do differently in the intergovernmental space. I feel, with the current strategic plan from 2022 onwards, which does commit to approaches, the integrated approaches to address the root causes of inequality and broader systems change. That's the actual wording at the opening, as well as a commitment to, approaches to address structural barriers. This is all feminist language coming from us. And I don't think it needs to wait till it goes mainstream. Let's remember the history behind not just UN Women, but the Commission on the Status of Women. It started as a subcommission on the commission under the Commission of Human Rights, and it broke away because of feminists. Feminists have been there from the beginning, since 1948, at the drafting of the UDHR, at the beginning of the Commission on the Status of Women. Feminist diplomats did this work. The former president of All India Women's Conference was a member of the original Commission on the Status of Women. And somehow, here we are in the 21st century being told that that's not our space, that's the member state space, that's the government space. And I guess, I want to maybe give you both a minute to say something about where the direction of our work is and where our place is in the intergovernmental space and beyond.
Maybe I could come in to give you, Sanya, the closing word, because I feel like you will be more powerful in closing. But I did just want to add just one piece that I was thinking about in this context of what is that role and what could we be using, how can we be using the space to both create room for collective action and multilateralism, which we need to have in a global, in our world, and our crises, our geopolitical crises are global, obviously. We've seen really powerful, some of the most powerful challenges to corporate power I've seen have come in the spaces of, grassroots tribunals and truth and reconciliation panels, and where, indigenous organizations are sharing the harm and the impact that has happened, and corporations are being held accountable. And if the UN could be a space that is providing the challenging of that corporate power in different ways, obviously the goal is to not have this harm created in the first place. But if it becomes a space which is not about what we often see, where communities that have been harmed are coming to the UN and finding those same corporations that have caused harm having a seat at the table and having space, as opposed to them having a space and a seat at the table. I mean, first and foremost, this is just recognizing in particular rights that already exist, such as the rights of Indigenous peoples to have a space inside the seat, a seat at the table. And this is something that is happening in the climate change negotiations, where Indigenous peoples are fighting for recognition that is not just putting them in a category right now, which these, private sector Indigenous peoples and other civil society is sort of lumped together. There are fights that are happening to change what recognition looks like and how we recapture multilateralism for the people, essentially. And I think that that's a space that feminists need to be vocal in, and we need to be vocal about the ways. I really love the ideas of kind of being this hub for feminist economists to really, if we are thinking about, gender lens investing or these ideas, that they're being led by feminist economists. I think it's something that we should not more, because we're already doing so, but I think it is a really important way forward. And again, something to go alongside this critique of what we don't want to see. I think there is a lot of scope in the vision and the work that so many feminists have done for so many years about what kind of world we do want to see, and how the multilateral space can be an actor in serving that vision. Over to you, Sanya.
Thanks, Bridget. And just to say that, yes, these kind of, our resistance is part of reclaiming the UN and reclaiming multilateralism, so that it's a people-centered multilateralism and not one that prioritizes private sector and capitalist interests. And just to say that we are still in the throes of the pandemic that has shown us how it's consolidated corporate power and the ridiculous profits that corporations have been able to make in the last few years, while we have seen our public services unable to cope because they've been decimated. And so this is also not the time for us to be meek and shy about the world we want to see. It's the time for us to fully step into a radical feminist imagining of how economies work for people and for the collective. And we've got mounting evidence that the neoliberal capitalist system, that economic model, it has failed. It has failed systemically, and feminists have been doing the labor to document these systemic failings. And that is why we are so disappointed to see that be the offering that's coming at this time. And we want UN Women to instead embrace a feminist economic justice lens, so that they are amplifying and supportive of our demands of how we have more feminist economies. We need them as active partners in this, because we know that stronger we are together. And so we also need to have, I love the idea in the chat, a feminist economic hub, yes. And let's interconnect the dots, because we also know that the fights are multiple and in the different spaces and processes, but that we are stronger together. And the fact that you've all shown up in the hundreds tells us that we are ready to reclaim the space, we are ready to reclaim the UN, we are ready to fight for the multilateralism that will serve us. And we know that the only way is a feminist economic justice way, period. No if, buts, or maybe. So yeah, just to say, that's where maybe I'll leave it.
Yeah, you made the right decision, Bridget, to push Sanya to close with that incredible feeling and that wonderful reminder that it is all interconnected. Racial justice is gender justice, is migrant justice, is economic justice, is redistributive justice. What it comes down to is our oppression is interlinked, and so is our liberation. So with that, I say, all the power to all the people. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you for listening, and we continue. We fight on. La lucha continua.